Good. Well, thanks for coming over. This we thought would be a good time to talk about summer travel as we head into the unofficial beginning of summer and a very busy travel season. TSA reported that Monday was the busiest air travel day they have seen since February 2020, with more than 2.6 million passengers. And this coming weekend, we're expecting to see levels we haven't seen since before the pandemic. FAA is projecting more than 51,000 flights on Thursday alone. So thought it was a good moment to talk about the state of play, what we're working on, how the system is doing, and obviously take up any questions that are on your mind. Let me start with some good news. We have seen airlines deliver considerable improvements in on-time performance in the past few months. Each month we've seen cancellations under 2%, including across that busy spring break season. That's better than the 10-year average, and so far this May, we're seeing those numbers hold. But this weekend will be a test of the system, and I think all of us have airline stories from last summer and the disruptions that took place then. Cancellation and delay rates were at unacceptable proportions last year, and it's important that that not happen again. So DOT is taking a twofold approach toward the airlines: collaboration where that is appropriate, pressure where it's necessary. We're working collaboratively with the airlines wherever we can to take steps that are going to help them reduce congestion and increase capacity. And then when things go wrong, we're using our tools to press airlines to continue improving customer service and to continue improving performance. I do think it's worth noting that just over 2 years ago, when President Biden took office in the worst stages of the pandemic, the biggest concern around our nation's airlines was whether they would be able to stay in business at all, and if they did, how many years it would take them to recover. But of course, President Biden acted swiftly to restore the economy. Demand came back faster than most forecasters thought was possible, and as we saw, some U.S. airlines struggled to meet that demand. When it comes to delays, weather remains the top cause of airlines delays, but I want to point out that the airline industry's own data from last year showed that issues that are under the control of airlines caused over a third of all cancellations, and that was more than any other year in the past decade. I'll also say air traffic control staffing issues were responsible for about another 5% of delay minutes, which is something I'll come back to in a minute. The goal is a smooth travel experience, and at DOT, we are always prepared to work with airlines when there are steps we can take that could help. In New York, that means allowing airlines to use larger planes with more seats at lower frequencies, which means they can move more passengers with less congestion. And it's showing signs of working. New York City airports will have about 2% more available seats than usual. In Florida, where, believe it or not, commercial space launches are now happening often enough that it can affect airline on-time performance, we are engaging the space sector to keep more of their launch windows and the accompanying closures clear of peak travel times. To the extent that air traffic control staffing can be a constraint in certain markets, we're working on that. FAA is in the process of hiring more air traffic controllers than ever to keep up with the growing demand. And we recently activated 169 new, more efficient flight routes that are going to save time and money compared to the older routes. So DOT is doing its part, and airlines need to do theirs as well. And when they don't, we're here to enforce passengers' rights and hold airlines accountable. In just over 2 years, we have delivered some of the most significant gains in airline passenger protections in decades. To date, we have helped air travelers get over $1 billion in refunds from canceled flights since this administration began. We have secured enforceable commitments from almost all major U.S. airlines to provide free rebooking, guaranteed meals, and hotel vouchers when they're responsible for cancellations and major delays. And we've proposed a series of new rules that would require airlines to be transparent about fees for things like extra bags or being seated next to your kids. And just a few weeks ago, we initiated a new rulemaking that would, for the first time in U.S. history, require airlines to compensate passengers in situations where the airline has caused a major delay or cancellation. Because too often, when your flight does get canceled or delayed, you wind up paying the cost in terms of ground transportation, food, lodging, and of course, in terms of your time. Anyone who's planning to travel this summer, I recommend checking out the services and commitments that different airlines have offered through our website, flightrights.gov. You can see which airlines already commit to compensation in cash, miles, or vouchers, which ones don't. And if you run into a problem, like an airline denying you a refund or failing to keep its promises, that website illustrates how to file a complaint with us. And just to give an illustration of how that process can work, a passenger named Hannah Imoru did this when her flight was canceled last year. She and her husband and their 2 young children were in Green Bay with family for the holidays and were driving to the airport to get home to Houston when they got a notification saying that there was a problem. They pulled over, they spent the next 40 minutes trying to speak with someone from the airline, and when Hannah finally got to a representative, they couldn't tell her why the flight was canceled. They refused to book her family on another airline, and they said the earliest flight they could manage to get her on was 4 days later. So like most passengers and working parents, Hannah and her husband were not in a position to wait that long. So they rented a car, they began to drive home, they spent $1,100 on the rental, gas, and hotels along the way, but she also saved her receipts. She filed a complaint with DOT, and eventually that led to the airline refunding the cost of her family's canceled flights and issuing travel certificates and reimbursing the family for many of their expenses. This is a country that ushered in the aviation age. We ought to have the best aviation system in the world, and we are here at work to make sure that passengers have that support. So with that, happy to take up any questions that folks have.
Are you confident that what you're doing is enough to avoid the recent airline meltdowns that we've seen?
Well, airlines are responsible for delivering a high standard of service. I have seen, again, a lot of improvement in terms of the numbers so far this year, and I'm confident that the customer service commitments that we have secured from the airlines are going to make a difference. But part of why I'm drawing attention to the work that we're doing is that we know that passengers continue to face issues, and I want passengers to know that when they do, we have their back. Yeah.
In March, the FAA said that air traffic control staff would be out at about 81% nationally and 54% in New York this summer. Are you meeting those targets, and when can we expect air traffic control staff to get back to 100%?
So we have come forward with a measure of optimal staffing that actually shows a wider gap than what we'd seen in the past, because we think it's important to be upfront and transparent about that. The optimal numbers that I'd like us to be at are about 3,000 north of where we are. Now we're hiring 1,500 this year. If the president's budget proposals are accepted, that's another 1,800 in the year to come. So it is going to be a journey, especially when you factor in attrition, to get to the levels that we want to see. And COVID blew a hole in our training pipeline, which we are still working to recover from, although we've made great progress. So I think it'll be a while before we're at the levels that we would like to see, especially in some of those more challenging areas like N90 and the New York market. The Jacksonville area has been a concern too, but we've made headway. It's headed in the right direction. We're really looking for the budget resources to keep it heading in the right direction, and it's one of the things that we're watching closely in terms of the budget negotiations happening right now.
Thank you.
Thank you, Secretary. Many U.S. airlines are reporting record revenue for recent quarters, but they're also partly or mostly being offset by rising costs. Aircraft fuel is the biggest cost increase for many airlines, but labor and other fees are, contributing to expenses. Have you, at the department, received complaints from airlines that some of the federal steps are contributing to increased costs, like expectations for them to do so and so? Do you think that those are significant costs? If they say, "Oh, this will increase our cost," do you think it's enough that it would matter?
I think this is the counter argument you get anytime you try to introduce a higher standard or put forward regulation for how an industry treats its customers. I also think that these airlines can be perfectly profitable while treating passengers better. And that's what we're seeking to do here, both raising the floor with regulation and highlighting who goes beyond that floor with the transparency that you can get through the dashboard on flightrights.gov. So we're not going to prescribe every little detail of customer service, but we are trying to raise the bar on that. And I think that we can have affordable flights, profitable airlines, and happier passengers by doing that. Let me also just mention, we are, again, in the spirit of working on anything that is under our control. I know this is a bit of an eye chart here, but basically, as we move from more of the blue routes to the green routes, which is more direct routing that involves fewer hops from one radio beacon to the next and more paths that use GPS, it means a more direct path. And that in turn means less time up in the air for the same segment, which means lower costs. So anytime we can do something, even if it's very back end and technical like that, that's going to make a difference, we'll do our part to try to help keep costs under control.
Aside from air traffic control, are there other areas of staffing, baggage handlers, TSA, other places where you're concerned, either regionally or in kind of various sectors like that?
Well, we know that on the airline side, staffing was one of the biggest issues that contributed to last year's problems. Most of the airlines are indicating that they've made big gains in terms of pilots, but not necessarily fully recovered, depending which airline you talk to. Mechanics is looking like a continued pinch point. Less clear to us where we are in terms of the baggage handling, because that is so specific to an individual airport, but something we're keeping an eye on. I have to refer you to DHS on the TSA numbers, but what I understand from them is that they are pretty close to where they had been previously. And so still going to be a lot of pressure on the system, but I think probably less of a constraint than it would have been a year ago.
How concerned are you that air traffic control staffing will lead to more delays in places like Jacksonville Center? We saw issues in Denver twice over the last couple of days. How concerned are you that that is going to continue to build, given the fact that it's going to take a couple of years to shore up the shortage?
Yeah, it's a concern, and it's part of what motivates us right now to be putting so much emphasis on the recruiting, the hiring, and the training. We need to make sure that we have the workforce that's ready to have more of a cushion. Now, I do want to stress, because I think sometimes the way this gets talked about publicly, people imagine that there's an empty seat somewhere, where really what we're talking about more often is reserve capacity or the ability to absorb an unexpected disruption, like the Denver situation, where it largely had to do with somebody being sick, COVID. We need more layers that allow us to absorb that, but it's certainly a concern.
Just a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
Because I spoke to NTSB Chair Jennifer Hominy today, and there was this whistleblower complaint about controllers feeling overworked at Jack Center, and she says it's a safety issue, especially as we see these Runway Incursion issues happen since the start of this year. So what do you say to that? I mean, it seems like maybe the short-term fix is not as good as the long-term fix.
Well, the best solution is the long-term fix, which is to make sure that we have enough of a cushion in the staffing model that we can absorb anything that comes up operationally, anything that affects a particular tower or particular center. But I also want to emphasize that FAA is not going to allow an unsafe condition to arise. So, there are very strict requirements in terms of how long a controller can be on station, for example. We are not talking about weakening any of those standards in order to accommodate any of the issues that are coming up. Safety has to be a bottom line, and that's where, at the end of the day, we don't want to see any operational impacts, delays, cancellations, or any of that, but would rather see that than any kind of safety problem arising.
Is there any potential fallout for summer air travel if there's a default?
I know it won't be good. It's difficult to even fathom some of the implications. I think, honestly, the biggest thing that I would be worried about is severe economic damage. So right now, a lot of the problems we have arisen because demand came back so quickly, because the economy came back so quickly, that passengers had the income and the inclination to get back to the skies years before most forecasters thought they would. A default puts us in the opposite scenario. Maybe the problem wouldn't be a system that's bursting at the seams, but I do expect it in the same way that, I wouldn't even say expect, because default's not an option, we can't let it happen. But one of the many reasons that we can't let it happen is that you would be seeing the kinds of economic harms that we just lived through, only worse and less temporary.
Would there be an impact on FAA staffing, anything at DOT?
So in the short term, the operations continue. I think in the long term, the macroeconomic effects could have any number of second-order consequences for our ability to do our work.
Let's follow up.
I just want to make sure I get to everybody once before we get to follow-ups.
Oh, thanks.
On the FAA issue, I think in March the FAA said that staffing was a factor in 42,000 flight delays last summer, and you were going to reassign some airspace from Newark to Philadelphia to address the staffing issue. Is that still going to happen, that reassignment? And if you get those 3,000 controllers, do you think you have enough buffer to prevent the kind of sort of staffing-related issues we've seen on terms of flights?
So, to the first piece, we're continuing to work on solutions for N90 to make sure that we do right by the workforce there and meet operational needs. And I think we'll get to a good place. In terms of the operational benefit, yet the more cushion we have, the less likely it is that a staffing issue will contribute to any cancellation or delay. You can still never say never, because again, some of this is what happens if you have an inordinately large number of people somehow become ill or unable to work at a particular station, and how do you capture that? I think a lot of folks might not understand how specific to a location your qualifications are. But I also I want to come back, I think we have some numbers on this somewhere. This is really important to emphasize. We are always going to own any issue that is under our control. But these data from recent months would suggest that 8% or less of the cancellations have had to do with staffing. So if you, basically the way I'd explain it is, this is God, this is the airlines, this is us, right? And by the way, within that NAS number, only some of that in turn is staffing. So that's not to minimize, anything that's under our control we're gonna work and we're gonna own. But I wanna make sure that the attention is proportionate to the share of the problem that is. And similarly, when we ran the numbers in terms of delay minutes, as I mentioned earlier, I think in terms of delay minutes, we're talking something in the neighborhood of 5%. But yes, those locations you mentioned are among the areas where we see that pinch.
Just on some reference to the NTSB, they're having a forum on runway incursions. You've spoken out about this. A few months into the issue since January, where do you think we are? Do you feel more confident, given where the numbers are going, that this is being addressed?
I want to say this cautiously. We are seeing early and preliminary indications that the level of severe runway incursions is coming closer to the norm. But I think during that cluster of incursions that we saw early this year, we decided to look at this a new way, where in the same way that if there were to be an incident or a crash, we would act immediately to learn everything we can about how to make sure it can't happen again. We treat close calls in more the same way. I think that's helping. The emphasis so far, as I understand in the forum, has been around getting back to basics, around situational awareness. This is also what's driving a lot of the investments that we're making. Obviously a longer term solution, but sometimes the best technology is concrete, and that's why some of what you're seeing are the construction of these end-around taxiways that just mean one less potential conflict point where a plane lines up. And we just had about $100 million headed out to 12 facilities around the country that are going to help. I do have some numbers on this, I think, too. Let's see if I can find them. One asterisk on this is sometimes there is a lag in an incursion being categorized as Category A, Category B, so there might be some recent ones that are in the headlines that have not yet been evaluated by the FAA. But generally what you're seeing here is the trend in terms of the overall rate of runway incursions has been steady, but the ones that are most concerning, Category A, Category B, are up in 2023. And until we see that moving nearer to zero, we're going to continue to be concerned, and we're going to continue to apply extra effort to dealing with that.
In terms of the pilot shortages, I know, again, that's an airline issue, but moving forward, what steps will the DOT take to work with airlines? A lot of them now expecting to see wave retirements moving forward. I know you've said in the past you're not looking to weaken or change any training requirements, but what steps can DOT take to work with the airlines?
Yeah, to me, it's not about lowering the bar. It's about helping more people get an opportunity to do the work and then clear that bar. And that is something that, to their credit, I've seen a lot of airlines step up on too. I've visited a number of facilities that are training the next generation of pilots, training the next generation of mechanics. And we're excited to see that work, and we're helping where we can. There's some work that FAA can do to encourage people to go into these career fields. There's also a bit of a gap that I think opens up a bigger policy question, which is there is actually more support in terms of subsidies, loans, scholarships for somebody training to be a lawyer or a dentist than there is for somebody training to be a pilot. And while there's a great income on the back end, if you get into that career, there is a costly path into that. And I think we need to continue working on that. I'll also add, obviously, it's always difficult in the thick of labor negotiations to get through to the other side. But part of what you would see from a good outcome in the many negotiating processes now underway is a healthier career field and a stronger pipeline for the future. So I'm confident that the airlines can meet their staffing needs, but it's not going to be overnight. We're here to help where we can. Yeah.
Follow-up, you said that 8% of the cancellations and delays were due to NAS. Is that federal staffing? At federal staffing levels, you said 33% with the airlines and 8% that's federal staffing?
Yeah, let me actually, this is actually interestingly not our data. This is the airline industry lobby group's data. Yes, so I believe, somebody can stop me if I say anything wrong here, that the things that get booked in NAS are anything that would be operational to include staffing and availability, but also anything else ATC that's not driven by weather. Does runway count as in our NAS figure?
Runway equipment, basic weather. The God weather is extreme, but basic weather, runway, and staffing.
Okay, so like if you have a de-icing program, is that going to go under NAS or is that?
That's going to go under NAS.
That'll go under NAS as well.
That's federal and airline staffing for under that 8%?
No, if it's airline staffing, then you're going to see it in the air carrier segment there.
And to clarify about the default, that definitely will not happen. FAA is, most of the FAA workers are essential services, and so, God forbid, they'll still be working if there's a closure of some kind?
There's not a standard I mean, Treasury is working through what to do in what order, right?
We've seen it happen, I hate to mention, we've seen shutdowns happen.
Right, but remember, this is not a shutdown, right?
What?
So on one hand, well, I'll just say, it's a very different scenario than a shutdown. In fact, technically, it doesn't entail a shutdown, but it entails disruptions.
Excellent context.
Yeah.
In terms of enforcement, is there anything to report out on the Southwest investigation?
Yeah, it's underway. Obviously, a big process. Let me just remind you that there's two pieces to it. There's the realistic scheduling issue, and then there's the customer service issue. Results from one may come sooner than another. I'll say that much.
Can I follow up on that? Yesterday, you fined LATAM Airlines $1 million. I think that's one of like the roughly 10 carriers you've been investigating. Can you give us an update on sort of how many carriers are still under investigation for delayed refunds?
Yeah, there's still quite a few. So yeah, the LATAM is the latest finding, and that was initiated some months ago. And we were able to leverage, I think, over $60 million in refunds. And I always want to emphasize, the point of the fine is not the fine. The point of the fine is to propel money back into passengers' pockets. We're up about 60, right? And I think it would be accurate to say about half a dozen investigations are still pending along those lines.
And on other investigation on the no Time Outage from January, where are you in terms of feeling confident that you have the safeguards in place to ensure that that couldn't happen again, and more broadly, what's needed on the technology front, if you think?
So I'm confident that in terms of both the processes and practices that led to that issue, and in terms of the database setup, that particular sequence of events could not happen again. But we need to accelerate NOTA modernization. One more example of something that's in the president's budget that I hope will not be viewed as unimportant by House Republicans just because it's non-defense discretionary spending.
Can I ask one about Unruly Passengers? Because it seems like there are headlines again of them coming back in a way. Maybe the rate is not up as much as it was in 2021, but it seems to still be an issue. What is your message to passengers now that the mask mandates have gone away, but there are still these problems?
Well, the simple message is don't. Don't do anything that would cause a threat or a disruption to your fellow passengers and your flight crews. The pilot always says that flight attendants are there primarily for your safety, and that's right. And for that reason, as well as basic human decency, they should be treated respectfully. Now, I'm encouraged we're down about 80% from the peak, but the numbers we see are, even one is too many. And so we're seeing results from the zero tolerance posture that FAA has taken up, and a number of even criminal referrals where appropriate or major fines. And I think that's having an effect, but we do need to continue pressing on this because it's obviously a workplace issue for flight attendants, and it's a safety issue for everybody.
And to piggyback off of that, let me ask, what is the message just in general for passengers going out? And this is a lot of people traveling all at once, and we saw 2.66 million people the other day, and 10 million people over the weekend. What do you hope they think and feel as they go into an airport and get onto a commercial airliner, having not been on 101?
Yeah. First of all, I hope that passengers, the vast majority of whom will get to where they're going on time and as expected, also know that if they run into an issue, that this department has their back. I want passengers to know just how much work goes into keeping them safe, and to remember that that's why we have this level of safety we don't take for granted, where the form of transportation that involves being propelled through the air miles above the surface of the ground is also the safest way to get around. Tragically, statistically, probably within the amount of time that we've been in this room, we've lost at least one American on our roadways, something we're working aggressively to deal with. But I wish that roads or railroading or any other form of transportation had the safety record that aviation does. We're working hard to keep it that way. I want passengers to know their rights. That's why we're always reminding them about flightrights.gov. Before you book, check to see how airlines treat their passengers and what they've committed to. And then after you commit to an airline, check to see what you're entitled to so that you can chase that up. But the bottom line, we want everybody to have great travels this coming weekend and this summer. We're doing everything we can to press airlines to deliver that good service. And if there is an issue, we have your back.
One more on the roads. You mentioned NHTSA earlier this month asked ARC to recall 67 million airbags that could be defective. The company has refused to do so. Can you give us an update about what the agency's next step is, and what should consumers do who are driving these 30 million plus vehicles that have these airbags?
So we'll get you more in terms of the timeline. There's a procedural timeline that was initiated when NHTSA sent its letter, and then ARC has their period to respond. I'll note that GM initiated a voluntary recall, and I think the next step that you would see is through the OEMs, and so it'll really come down to the specific model, specific car that you have. So watch for more, because this process obviously needs to play out. But this is being done as part of that exceptionally high standard that we also expect of automakers, and obviously was not a step that NHTSA took lightly.
From automakers, can I ask a question about EVs?
Sure.
Okay. So 151 House Republicans just yesterday wrote a letter to the Biden administration on the environmental regulations targeting gas-powered vehicles. They say it would lead to higher costs for consumers, increased dependence on China. So can the administration pledge to make sure these parts of EVs are not sourced from China, and what are you doing right now to make sure that happens?
Well, that's exactly what we're working on. So I have visited facilities in places like Glendale, Kentucky, DeSoto, Kansas, that are going to generate thousands of jobs creating EV batteries with American workers on American soil, making good money, by the way, often six-figure pay that you don't even have to have a college degree to earn, although it requires a lot of skill. And coming from an auto town like South Bend, Indiana, once home to Studebaker, I know the power of those thousands of good-paying jobs in those communities. And I don't know why anyone in elected office would want to slow down America's progress into that EV revolution. I would also note that we do careful cost-benefit analyses on regulations related to the efficiency of gas cars, and those rules have saved Americans huge amounts of money in terms of gas and diesel costs. And of course, making EVs more affordable will also make it easier for more Americans to take advantage of the fact that it is cheaper to fill up a car or truck with electrons, typically, than with gas or diesel. So this is all about making sure that we have, yes, cleaner air, but also saving drivers and passengers money, and making sure that America and not some other country takes the lead in this EV revolution. And I'll tell you, China is doing everything in their power to beat us in EVs. And I don't think it's because the Chinese Communist Party is particularly enthusiastic about the climate. I think it's because they understand the economic security benefits of being first. That's why we're investing so much in onshoring, nearshoring, and friendshoring the EV supply chain, while also making EVs more affordable for Americans to buy.
About the EV supply chain, minerals for batteries like coltan, lithium, cobalt, all that is going to become more and more important over the decades. Not exactly you're not exactly responsible for that. Do you foresee there will be more federal rules for ethical sourcing to make sure all these minerals are going to come from an ethical supply chain as it gets more and more important?
Well, our preference is for the supply chain not only to be ethical, but to be domestic. Where that's not possible, then this obviously becomes important too. And what you're seeing in terms of the work that is, not so much in our department, but certainly Secretary Granholm in the Department of Energy leading a remarkable body of work to drive more investment here in the US. And I would mention that it's not just in sourcing the raw materials, but also refining them, that we often have gaps. Where there are countries that act contrary to our interests or our values, notably China, that have a bigger share of that. That doesn't have to be so, and that's part of why these investments are making a big difference. So, of course, it's something we pay a lot of attention to, because we don't want our electric future to be as fraught when it comes to how it's fueled as our petroleum past has been, and what that has meant in terms of, for example, our exposure to the politics of the Middle East.
All right, we have time just for one more question.
Can I just ask you, you've talked about Tesla a couple times recently. The Autopilot investigation is now, getting close to 2 years old, like in August. There have been a lot of crashes that NHTSA is investigating. I know you've raised concerns about the naming of Autopilot, but what about just, do you think the agency needs taking action? And are people misusing the technology? And are there enough safeguards to ensure that Autopilot cannot be misused by people on the road?
Well, this is exactly why we have, first of all, this standing general order to get more data, and these pending activities that are going on. There is a real concern that's not limited to the technology itself, but the interaction between the technology and the driver. I cannot emphasize enough for every driver out there that an advanced driver assistance system is not an advanced driver replacement system. There is nothing you can buy today that doesn't require you to be paying attention. Let me also say, though, and I'll say this for the technologies that are being developed, is that the question is not, are they absolutely free of problems or 1,000% foolproof? The question is, how can we be assured that they will lead to a better set of safety outcomes than we have today? And given the very, very troubling safety record that human drivers have, this technology has a lot of promise. We just have to make sure it unfolds in a responsible fashion, and that it's always making us more, not less safe. All right. Thanks. Appreciate it.